Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad.
Scars are celebrated. They're proof that you lived through something, and therefore beautiful. And I love that idea. And somewhere in there, I don't know if it was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, but somewhere in there I realized, you know what? I'm not hiding any of this crap anymore. And that weight went away. It took me a couple books to get there. But I realized looking back, those scars are still there. I still worry with every book we put out. Like, we're talking because we're in the middle of a book launch, and I'm still like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose it all. And I still have my bar membership that I pay those renewal dues every year for 20 plus years now because I'm terrified if it all goes away and I need to practice law, what am I going to do?
Coming up, the journey of prolific New York Times bestselling novelist, historian, comic book hero, and TV personality Brad Meltzer. His latest book, I Am Anne Frank, is perhaps his most important work to date. Stay with us. Full Disclosure airs on NPR One, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts at linkfulldradio.com. Joining me is the person whose picture shows up when you Google bestseller. Brad Meltzer. Too many novels and TV projects to list here with any brevity, but I'll tell you that his illustrated children's books, including I Am Amelia Earhart and I Am Abraham Lincoln, inspire children the world over, including my own Munchkins. The next in the series, I Am Benjamin Franklin, and perhaps Brad's most important book, I Am Anne Frank, hit. He is an esteemed graduate of North Miami Beach High School and was also born on April Fool's. Did I miss anything, sir?
The most important part is that we went to the same high school. I was excited for this interview more than anything just to hear that as part of my intro.
Oh, gosh. We share a birthday. And you know who else went to the same high school? Is I sit in the cheap seats, but there's Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook.
Well, Sheryl didn't you see? Sheryl just blasted out I Am Anne Frank for us.
That's beautiful. And the MAGA bomber who's in prison. I don't think he's going to be blasting this out. But I digress, as I normally do, sir. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that you actually were able to take the good and the bad from our high school in one sentence. That was really nice. Well done.
I have to ask you this. So, you went to law school, and I looked back at the speech that you gave at your undergrad alma mater, University of Michigan, on encouraging people to look at the experience after college as not as an escalator, and I need to rise up the ranks and play the game or whatever the metaphor is, but jump off, take a leap of faith. And you did that even after going to law school and being an illustrious law school grad. You went to a great law school in Columbia Law. You were on the law review, but you managed to find your passion and not bill hours for the rest of your life. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think and what that speech, that commencement address I gave at Michigan was really about is the hardest thing in life. And the hardest thing in life is admitting what you love. And the truth is I went to law school out of fear because when I moved to North Miami Beach, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And when my dad was 39 years old, he lost his job. And he called it at the time the do-over of life, as if it was a fun game. The truth was it was terrifying because he had no money. He had $1,200 to his name. He had no job. We had no place to live. He picked everything up and he moved us to Florida on a lark because my grandmother lived there, like everyone's grandmother. And it wasn't just one of those times where we were kind of like scared of, we don't have money, but it was a moment we were scared about safety. Like we didn't know where we were going to live. We lived with my grandmother actually for months on end because we couldn't afford even a down payment for an apartment. And I gave a fake address so I could go to my middle school. I never could have possibly gone to NMB or Highland Oaks. I gave a fake address of someone so that I could go to the better school. Where we lived, I wouldn't be able to go to that school, and because I was in a worse neighborhood. And money was really, really hard on my family, really hard. And the truth is I didn't want my dad's life. I was terrified of having that. I was terrified. I'm still to this day. I say this, but in the past, my wife knows I always speak about it in the present tense. It is still what haunts me. My biggest moment is coming home from school and seeing my dad at 3:00 and sitting in a chair. And when your dad's home in the middle of the day, something's wrong, and him saying, I got fired. I always still to this day believe you can lose everything in a moment. And because I did, I lost everything in a moment. And I went to law school solely because I was terrified to have that. I needed something to fall back on because my dad was bad with money and he never had anything to fall back on. And what really happened is right before I went to law school, a guy named Eli Siegel said to me, became my mentor and said, listen, I want to be your mentor. I love the way you hustle for everything and you remind me of me. I grew up also in Brooklyn and I want to take you under my wing. Don't go to law school. He said to me, come work here, work for me. If you love it, you'll have some money in your pocket. And if you hate it, you can leave after a year and you'll have money in your pocket. Either way, you get a good year and you can pay off. I was in debt from college at Michigan. You can pay off your loans and everything else. And I thought that's a good deal. So I move all my stuff to Boston. I move everything to Boston. And the week I get to Boston, he leaves the job. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've wrecked my life. And so Robin, I did what all of us do in situations where we think we wrecked our lives. What every one of us would do is I said, I'm going to write a novel. I was like, that seems like the logical thing. And I started my first novel. My first novel got me 24 rejection letters. There were only 22 publishers at the time. I got 24 rejection letters. But that was the moment where I figured out and finally found what I truly loved, and it was to write. And I said, if they don't like that book, I'm going to write another. And if they don't like that book, I'm going to write another. But I went to law school because I just didn't have the money to kind of write on the side and have my parents pay for it. I went to law school because as I said, I was terrified to have my dad's life in case everything didn't work out and it all went away.
What were you doing to make ends meet between kind of debt from University of Michigan and the bohemian lifestyle and writing and law school debt and everything else, if I could ask you?
Yeah, no, I stayed at the job where Eli hired me. I could never afford to leave it. So I was actually working in marketing at Games Magazine, selling classified ads. Games Magazine is a puzzle and gaming magazine. If you know the magazine, you have a high IQ because it was for people with high IQs at the time. It just was like one of those puzzles and gaming magazines. And I sold classified ads. That was what I did to make ends meet. And I kept the job throughout law school because it would help me pay for law school. They were kind enough. They knew I needed the money. But even in college, I would sell T-shirts. One of my favorite things I ever did, and you will appreciate this, is when we went to college, it was the year The Simpsons launched. And everyone, of course, knows The Simpsons now. But back then, no one knew what it was. I knew it from the Tracy Ullman Spike and Mike festivals before Tracy Ullman put it on the air. And the first episode aired, and I turned to my buddy, who was an artist, and I said, this thing's going to be big. We should make T-shirts on it. And we made, as far as I know, I spoke to actually Bill Morrison, who works with Matt Groening. As far as we can date, we made the first ever bootleg T-shirts in history. And we literally taped it off the first episode. I ran off 300 T-shirts. We sold 300 T-shirts in 2 hours. I ran off another 300 T-shirts. And I was a kid now from Miami at the University of Michigan. I would walk into the Ann Arbor Bank with basically like $10,000 cash. I didn't even have a bank account. I was like, can I deposit? They for sure with a Miami driver's license thought I was a drug dealer. Right. And that was how I paid for college and for law school is in sales.
Your first novel, as you said, received 24 rejection letters. You told the audience at the University of Michigan when you were giving the commencement address that you took a step back and realized that your favorite class at law school taught the inner workings of the U.S. Supreme Court. Ergo, your second novel, The 10th Justice. Give me the backstory.
Yeah, so I'm sitting in my first year of law school daydreaming because that's what I always, anywhere I am is what I'm doing. And I remember in that first semester, I was literally in the back of class. The professor said something about how the Supreme Court had 27-year-old clerks that helped write the decisions as they came down to the public. And I remember in the back, I literally wrote, they gave us this free little notepad that we could take. It was like a calendar before there were even Palm Pilots. And I wrote in the back, Supreme Court, and I wrote the word clerk, and I circled it, and I wrote book idea on the top. And after I got my 23rd and 24th rejection letter, a week later, I was working in Washington, D.C. at the time. Eli had brought me on, even though he had left the company a year later, he had brought me on as a speechwriter for AmeriCorps, the National Service Program. And I said, I was like, I'm going to write a book about the Supreme Court. I called up the Supreme Court at the time. I was like, hey, I'd love to come in and see it. And let's just say that's not how you get into the Supreme Court. And so I actually, at AmeriCorps, I called back, same number, the marshal's office who does security. And I said, hey, I'm calling from AmeriCorps, the National Service Program. We have a bunch of interns who would love to come down and get a tour. Can you give them a tour? And they said, oh, sure. What are their names? And I said, his name is Brad Meltzer. He'll be coming alone. And that is literally how I got past the crack security that was guarding our nation's highest court. They showed me around. They took me in. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg's daughter was actually one of my professors. And so I got some kindness there and got some help there. And the week after I got my 23rd and 24th rejection letter, I started a book called The 10th Justice that became my first novel. And I'll be the first to say it was the one that sold. The first one that still never sold, to this day sits on my shelf, published by Kinko's. But it was the second novel that I got. I got lucky. I'm the first to say it. I got lucky, right? It takes one person, Robin, to sometimes change your life. You just got to get one person to say yes. And we were lucky enough to find that person who took a chance on me. And the crazy part was, at the time, it's funnier now than it was then, but the guy who bought the book, and again, I was getting rejection letters, and there was this guy, an editor named Rob Weisbach, and he had found a guy named Jerry Seinfeld and published his book before he was Jerry Seinfeld. Then he did the same thing with a guy named Paul Reiser. Then he did the same thing with a woman named Ellen DeGeneres. And then he picked my fictional novel, his first ever fiction book. And I remember being in his office and going, what the hell am I doing here? Like, I'm out of my league and it'll never work. And the truth was, it was supposed to be just a tiny little book. But because he was such a big editor, and this is the part I never get to tell, but he left the job also. And I thought, oh my gosh, what do I do now? I don't have an editor, and he left the job. And I thought, oh, they'll give me a new editor. The publisher that I was at the time, was Bantam Books. And Bantam said to me back then, they would not return our phone calls. And they basically said to us, if you publish this book with us, we're going to bury it. We don't like it. The guy, Rob, liked it, but we don't like this book. We think it's crap. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm dead. Again, I watched right there what I said to you at the start. My whole life cratered in one day. It was all gone. Everything I thought I had was gone. And I left the publishing house and actually went with Rob. I actually made the jump to his new company. We were supposed to be like the second or third book that was published. And here's what changed my life. Is Paul Reiser was supposed to be the first book of this brand new imprint that Rob was doing. He was going to be, it was a follow-up. Remember, Mad About You was on at the time, and he was doing his follow-up book called Babyhood. He had done this book called Couplehood, and it was going to be a massive #1 bestseller. And God knows what reason, but Paul Reiser decides that he is going to delay his book because he wants it to like coincide with sweeps or something like that. I don't know what it was. And Rob had no other book that was ready to launch his imprint, but the imprint was launching. It was launching no matter what. You got to go. And the only book that was ready was mine. So the story became, my editor was 29 years old, I was 27 years old, and the story became, what are two 20-year-olds suddenly doing trying to take on all of publishing? And the New York Times did a big story, and it changed my life. And suddenly this tiny little book that was supposed to be a nothing throwaway got all this undeserved attention, and that was the start of my career.
You told the graduating Wolverines, you graduated from Michigan in 92. You told them in 2016 at commencement, at your 10-year reunion, I want you to be in that group that loves their work. You said the key to doing so requires the greatest risk you'll ever take in your life, admitting what you want. While it might sound simple, you told them, you warned that the pressure to conform and to keep pace with others' career trajectories can make the journey difficult. And we meet so many people who did go through the ringer, went to law school, billed hours, clerked and everything, and realize they maybe at age 40 or at age 45, they want to make a hard turn into teaching. And I look back at my 20s, and when I think about your body of work and your empathy and your candor, I just was nowhere near as resilient as you were at the age of 22, 23. I was terrified of failure. I was terrified of being off the track, of my classmates hearing, oh, what is he doing? He lost his job at a brokerage firm, or he's bouncing around, he's shopping a novel. You're out there telling people, which I learned belatedly, that no one should care and you shouldn't care. This is the time, the only time in your life really that, you're not going to be encumbered by family, by other things. You should be taking these calculated risks.
And listen, I wish I was so brave. It was easy to give that speech when I was 45 years old. I think the only reason I had the resilience in my 20s is because I had my ass kicked in my teens. That was it. I mean, I saw utter failure, like as almost as low as it can go beyond someone being murdered. I mean, my wife will tell you, it is my permanent scar. I know it's my permanent scar. I wear it proudly, there's this, I used to be embarrassed of it and wouldn't talk about it. You look at my first interviews for the 10th Justice, I won't say a word about anything in my past. I'm literally just giving baseball quotes like, I'm going to take it one day at a time. I hope people like this book. I'm just so happy to be here. And it was because I was like terrified to not project something that was perfect. And then somewhere, I don't know if it's maturity or anything else, I just realized, there's in America, we hate scars, right? We want a plastic surgeon, especially in Miami, to get rid of them. But in France, scars are celebrated. They're proof that you lived through something, and they're beautiful. And I love that idea. And somewhere in there, I don't know if it was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, but somewhere in there, I realized, you know what? I'm not hiding any of this crap anymore. And that weight went away. It took me a couple books to get there. But I realized looking back, those scars are still there. I still worry with every book we put out. Like, we're talking because we're in the middle of a book launch, and I'm still like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose it all. And I still have my bar membership that I pay those renewal dues every year for 20 plus years now, because I'm terrified if it all goes away and I need to practice law, what am I going to do? Because I know the moment, and maybe this is the best story I can tell you for it. This is true. Is every day that I sit down to write, this will be the most revealing way I can tell you about myself. So the 23rd and 24th rejection letter that I got on that first book, those were supposed to be acceptance letters in my head. I got 22 rejections. The 23rd and 24th were two people that actually said, we like your book and we want to even meet with you. Tell us more about it. We want to see what you're like. And I went to New York and had meetings with them. And it was a big deal to me. It was meetings with like grownups. And my editor at the time said to me, they love the book. They're going to bid on it. We're going to have a bidding situation and we're going to make you a lot of money right now. So I was like, wow, I was in all this debt. I was like, great, call me and tell me. And my editor told me, stay by your phone, because back in the day, there were no cell phones. You had to like wait by the phone. She told me what time to be there, and I got by the phone at whatever time it was. And I waited by the phone for it to ring, expecting when I picked it up for her to tell me, we made this much money, you're going to get out of debt. And I picked up the phone all excited. And as I brought it to my ear, I said, hello. And she said, sorry, kiddo. And my heart sank in my chest. And it was devastating, all gone. The 23 and 24 were all the rejections. Neither of them wanted it. And I'll tell you this, Robin, that every day for 20 plus years now, before I sit down the route, we all have our rituals. One of my rituals is I replay that moment in my head. I replay where I was, what kind of phone I was holding in my hand. It was one of those see-through phones where you could see the wires inside, like that was high tech at the time. I picture the Formica desk on my left from like the door store. On my right is a bed and a box spring, no headboard or anything fancy because we didn't have it. I look out over the terrace that we were in Washington, D.C., the parking lot, and on my left is a fire station. And I count the doors of the fire station, 1, 2, 3 in my head, and then I say those words to myself, sorry, kiddo. And I redo it for 20 years now because I never, ever want to be thankless for what I have. I never, ever want to be anything but as hungry as I was when I was 24 years old. And I never, ever want to think I made it, because the moment I think I made it, I'm finished. And for 20 years now, every single day I sit down to write, I say it, sorry, kiddo, sorry, kiddo, sorry, kiddo. That is what I do. And it is the thing I need.
Brings to mind my favorite song lyric by Nada Surf. Maybe this weight was a gift, like I had to see what I could lift, which was very near and dear to my heart.
I'm stealing that right now. Hold on, I got to write that down. That is A+.
And it was, in fact, the last line in my book. Maybe this weight was a gift. It took me a while. This is not about me, but like you, later in life, especially after becoming a father, I've learned to cherish my difficulties and my traumas, and they make me unique. And you never know what the other people with the cushy jobs and the, second and third houses and hedge funds are enduring at home in the shadow and the persona. But I would like to know, Brad Meltzer, what that first call was when you learned that you were on the bestseller list. As an obverse, as an antidote to the sorry, kiddo.
Oh, gosh, I remember where I was standing. I was in North Miami Beach in my girlfriend's house, now my wife. And we had just gotten, God, I love you for bringing me back. I feel like I'm in the Wayback Machine now. So we had just gotten, the week the book came out, these absurd reviews. Vanity Fair, Time Magazine, USA Today. I mean, it was absurd. I was like, well, I can't believe people are writing these nice things about this book that I worked on. And I remember back then there were no phones again, fax machines. So they said, stand by your fax. We have something to send you. I didn't even know. Again, I grew up in a house. There were no books. There were comic books because I read comics, but there were no books in my house. Sure. My parents, may both of them rest in peace, read 7 books in their lives. The 7 that I wrote before they died. Like, they did not read books. So I didn't even really know what the bestseller list was. I didn't know what, I had no idea what any of these things were that I was kind of I was like walking and rendering through this publishing world at the same time. And they told me, go buy your fax machine. And I put on the fax machine and they sent me this thing called the bestseller list. And there we were on it at number 8. And wow. I turned to my wife and I literally looked at her and I said, let the backlash begin. I knew exactly in that moment what was going to happen. I knew it because I know what happens all the time in history is like America loves to lift things up, but the moment it gets lifted up, what we love to do even more is swat it down. And I'm not joking. A week later, Entertainment Weekly published a review on the same book that everyone had universally said was, this incredible new voice, blah, 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 nonsense. And gave me a D plus, not even a B plus, a D like David plus, and just tore me apart ruthlessly. And so, and to me, it was like, okay, it was like the universe's way of balancing things out. But I will never forget that moment of sitting there and looking at my name. And I firmly believe to this day that getting a good review doesn't mean you're great. And you have to then, of course, accept that getting a bad review doesn't mean you're horrible. My agent once said to me at the very start, she said, I look on, and this was back in the day, Amazon had just launched, and they flew me to Amazon's headquarters at the time. And Amazon said to me in 1997, they said, we have this thing on our books where you can write a review right underneath where the book is listed. And they said, you don't sell the most books for us. There are authors who outsell you by like tens of millions of thousands, crazy bajillion numbers. They said, but you, for some reason, have more reviews than anybody else. And they handed me a folder that was like, a half-inch thick of printed out back then reviews. And the thing was, why? Because I was 27 years old, and 27-year-olds are the early adapters of technology. So they were the first ones on Amazon who figured out how to write reviews. And it was literally like there would be a half a dozen reviews saying I was the most horrible writer to ever approach literature, followed by a half a dozen that would say that I wrote the greatest new book of a new generation, followed by another half dozen that would say, no, he's ruined literature as we know it, and so on, ad forever. And I learned in that first year that whatever the review goes up first will be fought back within minutes. I watched it again in real time at hyperspeed. So I've never really thought, any of those things truly matter, but I'll never forget that moment when they actually said you get to be on the bestseller list.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You are listening to Brad Meltzer. In addition to his many works of fiction, his novels, he's one of the only authors to ever have books on the bestseller list for nonfiction, advice, children's books, and even comics books. You should associate him with Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum, the TV series based on your books. You've JV'd with Chris Eliopoulos. That can be seen on PBS Kids. You're also the host of Brad Meltzer's Lost History and Brad Meltzer's Decoded on the History Channel. And in addition to that, The Hollywood Reporter pegged you as one of Hollywood's 25 most powerful authors. So coming out of that euphoria and that fax, you go on over 20 years to really parlay this into becoming a multimedia guru. I guess you were voracious in seeking out collaborations, in being, I think it's been called creatively promiscuous, right? Doing children's books. You have a whole other side of your existence with comic books. This really opened up so many avenues for you.
Yeah, creatively promiscuous is like going to be my new tattoo. It's funny. I never, ever thought, I'm going to now parlay, that was the word you used, into anything. The truth was I just have, I don't know if it's a short attention span or I just have, I like other mediums. I just do. And when I started doing this, if you were a novelist, you were a thriller writer, you were supposed to forever be a thriller writer. I wanted to write my second book as like kind of a historical fiction thing. And they said, no, don't do that. You're going to ruin your career. And they had just put me on the bestseller list. So the truth was I was scared. And so I just wrote another thriller that was, in the legal world. I never made that mistake again. It was, to me, the book that the hardest book I ever to write because I wasn't writing what I wanted to do. And it was the worst reviewed book I ever got. And, one of the worst selling ones I ever did. I said, I will never, ever do that again. I'm only doing what I want to do right now. Again, learned it the hard way, and I watched it almost all go away. In fact, it did go away. Rob's publishing house shut down. And I remember I watched the second book had tanked, and I thought my whole life was disappearing right again, just like it did for my dad. And I remember calling my mom, and I was telling my mom, I lost the, publishing's down. We don't have a new deal. We lost the deal because Rob's house is shutting down. What do we do? And, and my mom said to me, I'd love you if you were a garbage man. And it wasn't anything she practiced, and she wasn't taking a crack at garbage man. My uncle was actually a garbage man. But she was just saying, I don't care if you're the king of England or whatever you do, I love you. And I needed that at that moment. But back then, I got offered, I'd always been hiding comic book references in my books since the very first book. And only the truest nerds in the country would ever find what I was doing. It would come, like one person would come up every event and be like, you like comics, huh? And I'm like, how, and they'd see that reference that I put in just that deep cut. And DC Comics noticed it. And then my fourth book came out. The last person in line was an editor from DC Comics who said, hey, do you want to write Green Arrow for us? The director, Kevin Smith, was writing Green Arrow at the time. It was their number one superhero book. And they said, if we hire another comic book writer, everyone's going to be like, what happened to Kevin Smith, the director? And no one was working in comics. Now, I know superheroes are the big thing and Avengers and Marvel movies are the big thing, but this is, back when nobody was cared about comics. The only person who didn't work in comics who wrote comics was Kevin Smith. The second person back then was me. And it wasn't cool. It just was what I loved. And I said, I'm going to go do it. I remember someone said to me, you're a best-selling novelist. Why are you going to go slum in comic books? And I was like, you ass. I'm like, because they're awesome. And I didn't even care. I was like, and they were like, why would you do that? I'm like, why not? It'll be fun. And they said to me, it's our number one superhero book. If you succeed, you'll succeed on a big stage. If you fail, you're going to fail in front of everyone. And I was like, you know what? I'll take those odds. I'll take that shot any day. And I started writing comics. And suddenly all these novelists, I remember I was on a panel with Janet Ivanovich and Walter Mosley, and both whispered to me they announced it that day, and they both, Walter Mosley leaned over to me and was like, does he still hang out with Speedy? And Janet Ivanovich was like, I want to write Wonder Woman. And suddenly I became like the drug dealer to novelists who wanted to break in the comics. And then when I wanted to do a TV show, I went to my agent and was like, I got an idea for a TV show. And they were like, novelists don't come up with TV shows. So I said, you know what? I'm leaving my agent. And I left the agency. I was this big famous agency who did my TV and film stuff. And they said, you can't do that. So I said, fine, you're fired. And I left the agency, went to a new agency, Endeavor, now WME. And I said, I want to do a TV show. They said, great, here's a TV agent for you. And he got us our show on the air. And suddenly I was doing television shows. And now people can do lots of different things. But back then, I just was like, this is the idea I have. And if you don't want to do it, again, it was nothing more than just me being young and stubborn and just refusing to listen to anyone who said a novelist can't do that. And so I don't know. I don't think it's parlay. I think it's just more like I was just too stupid to take no for an answer. And my dad taught me enough that, if you want something, you better chase it, because otherwise the world's going to take you apart for it.
When did you finally feel financially independent? I know for writing purposes, to kind of build a head of steam to write a book, you think back to that time of rejection and vulnerability. But at some point, clearly you're jumping from agency to agency. TV studios are interested in you. You have the cylinder of comic books firing. You're a novelist. You can venture into nonfiction, which you did prolifically. At what point did you kind of look around and say, I made it. I'm financially secure?
It's fine. I will never say I made it. Never. As I said before, if I think I made it, I am done. I will tell you that I, to this moment, sock money away because I just, that's the only way I know how to live, is like for the rainy day. Why? Because my dad did not know how to. My dad did not know how to save for the rainy day, and the rainy day would constantly hit and just was like a storm through my family. So I still have a very hard time saying no to things, because I'm always worried that it's going to all go away. It's going to all do something. So I don't, that thought, when you said it, I was like, wait, people think they made it? Like, who are those people? Like, it's not in my DNA.
Wow.
I know, it's crazy. I mean, I do think, listen, I certainly, I'm happy that my kid went off to college, and I'm like, I feel like, okay, we can, I'm happy that I don't have to stress about that. And on the financial side, I'm so thankful for what we have, but that comes from me just not being able, I still drive the same 6-year-old car. I know I can go buy a new one today, but that's just not how I don't know. I never want to lose whatever that is. And I feel like the moment I think I made it, I do firmly believe I'm finished.
We are going to get into Heroes for My Son and Heroes for My Daughter, that series, and Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum and the I Am Benjamin Franklin and I Am Anne Frank. But I need to ask you about the inflection point of becoming a father, especially in how you reflected with your insecurities as a kid, hiding your situation at home with having to put on a face at Highland Oaks or North Miami Beach High School. When did you become a dad? Tell me about how it changed your writing, how it changed the tempo, the outlook, what you wanted to write about, how you wanted to communicate to your children.
It's funny, I always, my first book was about 20-somethings living in D.C. because I was a 20-something living in D.C. And then I got married, and my second book was about a married couple. And then, truthfully, the fourth book was The Millionaires, was really about me struggling with being, I think, an adult and finally having, someone was paying me money. It was the first time we had to deal with that. So I don't know whether it's just that I'm really bad at hiding what I'm dealing with in my personal life, where I just firmly believe that you should put your stuff out there. I never consciously do it. I don't go like, oh, what's happening in my life, and I'll write about it. It's just, I always figure out what I'm writing about and what issue I'm having when I get to the end of the book. And I remember when my mom died, I was like, wait a minute, what am I writing about? I was on the last pages of this novel I was working on. I'm like, wait, this character lost his mother. And oh, crap, I'm writing about the loss of my mother. That's what this whole book is about. And books have always been a kind of free form of therapy for me. They let me kind of, I never consciously do it. I can't help but seep into what I'm working on. I wish I was smart enough to kind of think big theme at the start and then let it take me, but I don't. But I will, to answer your question, I became a dad. And then I started writing about that. And the day that I became a dad, I was driving home from the hospital, and I said, on the day that I was born, I will tell you this is true, my dad went and bought a bottle of champagne and said, I'm going to open this bottle of champagne at my son's, Brad's, wedding. And when we moved down from Florida, to Florida from New York, you put all your stuff in the moving van. There's a couple things you keep in the car that you don't give to the movers. And one of them was my mom and dad sat in the front seat when we drove to Florida. My sister and I sat in the back, and behind the two headrests were 2 bottles of champagne that used to roll back and forth in the Florida sun. And my parents knew nothing about taking care of champagne, but we were what they cared about. And when my son was born, I'm like, I don't care about champagne. I'm going to write a book for him to last his whole life. I'm going to fill it with rules to live by. I'm going to teach him how to be a good father. And I wrote this book, I told him, like, love God and be nice to the fat kid in class and, all these rules for him to be a good person. And the book was crap. It was like telling your kid to be good and expecting them to be good. And now as a parent, I know that that's silly. And it was a friend, Simon Sinek, taught me this amazing story about the Wright brothers, that every time the Wright brothers would go out to fly their plane, they would bring enough extra materials for multiple crashes, which means every time they went out, they knew they would fail. And they would crash and rebuild, and that's why they took off. And I love that story. And I wanted my sons to hear that story. I wanted my daughter to hear that story. I wanted everyone to know you dream big, you work hard, you have a good side order of stubbornness. You can do anything in the world. And that night, I started writing the book that became Heroes for My Son, which was not a book of rules, but a book of heroes. And then I wrote Heroes for My Daughter, and it was just one-page stories of inspiration to inspire my kids. And it's funny, at the time, I went to my publisher, and I said, I was a thriller writer. I was like, I want to write a new kind of book for kids. I said, but I don't want you to take me on just because you think I sell a lot of thrillers for you. I don't want you to take it on because you feel like you got to service it. I know you do that for other writers, and I don't want to be that guy. So if you don't like it, don't buy the book. And the head of the publishing house said, okay, Brad, we read it. We don't like the book. And I was like, what do you mean you don't like the book? It's awesome. And again, I left the publishing house. They rejected the book. They kicked me out. And I went to another publisher, and they published the book, and the book went up the bestseller list, I think, to the number 2 spot. And everyone said, how? And they had an advertising budget, Robin, of $0. $0 in advertising. And everyone's like, how'd you get that on the bestseller list? And I said, I didn't. I said, it's just that the culture is starving for heroes right now. And I want that for my kids. And there are other people who want it for their kids. It's these amazing heroes that people want, not me. But that book changed my life because it let me suddenly start writing nonfiction. And, again, everyone else said you can't do it. And I just found a publisher until they said yes.
I Am Amelia Earhart, your illustrated children's book with Chris Eliopoulos, and I Am Abraham Lincoln. These are fixtures at Children's Library at reading time. I think about Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum, and my daughter talking about Helen Keller and the empathy endlessly, and the way you made that palatable, across languages, across time, and made it understandable for little kids with thousands of questions that, a father can't answer. That has got to be striking to you to kind of step back, not that you're going to take a victory lap with this, but you're helping parents raise their children. And we're going to get into this conversation with Ben Franklin and Anne Frank, which is an essential protagonist to write about, an essential character to write about. We're both Jewish. Our children both hesitatingly learn about the Holocaust, and it's an exceedingly difficult thing to broach. And when I'm looking at this book, you have someone who's just so relatable to the present. When I was born, my sister loved laughing at my big ears. I also had big eyes and the cutest smile. I like ice skating and going to the movies and getting autographs. And yet there are these jarring pictures of Nazis posting photos up, don't buy from Jews, forbidden Jews, Germans unite. These are not in any way easy things to broach with 7 or 8-year-olds.
Yeah, we had someone yesterday put on Twitter for us. They said, we just got I Am Anne Frank. It's the most important book I've ever read to my son. And I can't possibly fathom that that's our book. But I know one thing. I banked on one thing my entire career, which is I'm not that special. And if I want this for my kids, which is who I wrote it for, then there are other parents who want that same lesson for theirs. But you read the most important page in the book. It's not about the Holocaust. It's not about the 2 years that she spends, which you'll see all of that in the book as well. But it's seeing that she loves to play tag and that she loves to go ice skating and she loves memorizing celebrities' names. Because when I taught my daughter, it started with Amelia Earhart. When I taught my daughter, Amelia Earhart flew across the Atlantic Ocean. My daughter was totally unimpressed. She said, "Dad, everyone flies across the Atlantic Ocean, big deal." But when I told her the true story that Amelia Earhart, when she was 7 years old, built a homemade roller coaster in her backyard, and she took a wooden crate and put roller skating wheels on it, shoved it to the roof of her tool shed, came flying down on the wooden slats, flew through the air, crashed, and gets back up again, my daughter's like, "Tell me that part again." She loved the part where Amelia Earhart was just like her. And that moment you read of Anne Frank loving to play tag and loving to ice skate, that's the most important page because kids go, "Oh, she's like me." And suddenly, when you see that people aren't allowed to be in swimming pools or shop in the restaurants they want to go to or eat in the places they want to eat, now it's just like you. And that's how, to me, I don't think of it as like I'm going to create empathy, but that is where empathy is built, is seeing yourself in someone else. It's the most important part of every book. We always start when they're kids. And there is no question when you look at where we are as a culture, anti-Semitism is at a 40-year high. There was I'm sure you saw the same stat I saw last week, a study that said millennials don't know the basic details of the Holocaust or that 6 million Jews died. Our kids need hope right now. And the best way to teach that is with I Am Anne Frank. I firmly believe in her story, the little girl who sits in an attic and hides from the Nazis, but still thinks people are good at heart. I need my kids to know that even in the darkest places, you can still find light, because that's what hope is, right? It's as it says in the book, it's a light that burns within you and nothing puts it out once you light it. And I need my kids to have that lesson.
You wrote in the book, and it's illustrated among people in a concentration camp behind barbed wires being directed by Nazi troops. We knew what a call-up really meant. The Nazis would send people to a concentration camp, a prison where Jews were locked up and made to work all day and night. There was almost nothing to eat or drink. If you went there, escape was nearly possible. And where I struggle with this is any curious kid is going to ask, what next? What happened after this book? You didn't take us to the horrific processing and the cattle cars and the gas chambers and the crematoria and the parents being pried away from their children, the stuff of nightmares for kids. And you talk about the insecurity of your own childhood. And this has got to be the most difficult and essential book that you wrote for children. But I am terrified of the conversation that I have to have with my daughter at the end of this book. Right? Of the questions that are still going to come up weeks and weeks afterwards.
I got it last night.
What happened to the prisoners?
Yes. No, listen, last night my sister got the book in the mail or wherever she bought it. She calls me last night. She read it to my 6-year-old niece. And I'm like, here we go, right? Render it in real time. And let's be very clear. I don't just write these things and say, hope for the best. We had a historian who used to work at the Holocaust Museum as an advisor. We had the Anne Frank Center for Hope in Atlanta came as advisors. How do we talk to kids about this? What should we show? What should we not show? The picture in the book, Chris Eliopoulos is the star of this book, our artist on the book, who makes sure that page isn't terrifying, right? He doesn't show you the blood and gore, but we don't hide it either. You see the uniforms and you see things. And it was important to me to kind of find that right balance. But my niece last night calls me on FaceTime, and I'm like, let's see what happened. And she loved the book and didn't go straight to the horrors, asked a couple questions. And we are very careful about it. You can see if your kids do ask, if you look in the timeline, which isn't in the main story, it'll tell you when Anne Frank dies. It'll show you actually that part. If your kid is curious about that part, then you are the one who, of course, as a parent, has to deal with what's next. And some kids are going to ask about it. Some kids won't. But I will tell you, I can see it in one day. Like, I can see how kids react. The best letter that I saw was someone who said, I was terrified to read this book to my child. I bought it, but I knew my 8-year-old was ready. I didn't think my 5-year-old was. My wife said, sure he is. And Brad, I want you to know, as always, my wife was right. And thank you. We've been talking for 2 hours, having a conversation that I was terrified about. In fact, my friend, one of our dear friends, this is a better story. The most important thing we do in the books is they're all cartoon. They look like comic books. They're kind of graphic depictions of these heroes. But the last page is always a real picture of the hero. And a friend of mine who's white, he has a black daughter. She's adopted. Was reading I Am Rosa Parks when it first came out, and I forget if she was 6, 7, 8 years old. And they get to the end of the book, and they see the picture of Rosa Parks, and his daughter looks at him, who's black, and says, "Wait, this really happened. This really happened." And he said, and suddenly he was having a full-on conversation about race with his daughter, which he said to me, I should have had years ago. We're a mixed-race family, but I was terrified to have the conversation. And I can't tell you how many people have said that to me. I mean, we are so scared of explaining hard things to our kids. And maybe it's because I just had the hard things explained to me when I was younger, and I felt like it gave me a strength. But I feel like if we wrap our kids in bubble wrap, we do them no favors. And certainly you shouldn't be showing your kids like bodies piled up after the Holocaust, when the camps are liberated. But I think our kids are always more resilient than you think they are. And when you arm them with that empathy early on, those become permanent memories. That's how you build, the best story in all of I Am Anne Frank is this story, is her view from the window of her attic was of a chestnut tree. And the tree was all she saw. That's all she could see. And in the winter, she'd watch the leaves fall off. In the spring, she'd watch them grow back. That was her television show. That was her YouTube. And obviously, Anne Frank dies. They preserved the tree in the house. It's, of course, now a museum. But in 2010, the chestnut tree, got blown over. But what happened is they took all the seedlings, the saplings from the tree, they started planting them around the world. And now there are Anne Frank trees blooming all across the globe. And we end the book with that story for a very obvious reason. Like, that's what Anne Frank's story is. And when you give it to your kids, it is planting a seed within them that blooms. So obviously you have to know your kid. I'm sure I'm going to get calls from people who are like, that was too intense for my kid or not. Read the book first. You know your child, but don't be afraid of hard conversations with your kids. I firmly believe that.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You're listening to New York Times best-selling author Brad Meltzer. The latest are I Am Anne Frank and I Am Benjamin Franklin. I would like to ask you, kind of in the 10 minutes or so that we have left, this is a chance for you to kind of turn it around and maybe hold the hands of frustrated creatives out there. We are in a pandemic. We are in a deep economic slowdown. Content, you see these criticisms that it's a situation of the haves in terms of bestsellers and the have-nothings. The book industry is shrinking. TV is changing. If you're a college graduate right now, or if you're a person who is maybe clutching that LSAT prep kit and wondering about the next phase, I don't like having debt. I'm worried about my job. I have these creative urges, and yet there's no visibility in this world, which is such a volatile and risk-fraught world with the pandemic. What's your advice?
Listen, I got 24 rejection letters on my first book. 24 people who told me, you shouldn't do this, give up, you're never going to make it. And I don't look back on the experience and say, well, I was right and they were wrong and ha ha on them. I firmly believe life is subjective. And as I said at the start, all it takes is one person to say yes to your work. One person. And your job is to find that one person. I firmly believe that whatever it is you choose to do, whether it's about law or whether it's about art or whether it's about, you want to teach or whatever it might be, don't let anyone tell you no. Don't let anyone tell you no. I mean, it is why I sit every day and sorry, kiddo, sorry, kiddo, sorry, kiddo. Those things, use that as rocket fuel. And again, art is harder. The world is harder. Publishing is harder. All those things are harder. But you know what's harder? Being miserable in middle age and wishing that you should have done something, you could have done something, and looking back and regretting it. I used to scoop ice cream at the Aventura Mall and in North Miami Beach and at Haagen-Dazs. And there was this woman, I actually just remembered, I think this is in my speech. I forgot this is in my speech, but I love this story. There was this woman who came and she was snapping her fingers at me, trying to get my attention. I said, ma'am, I'll be with you in a moment. And she started snapping her fingers again and eventually was like, you better serve me now. And I was like, ma'am, you're being rude. And she said, you better serve me now. And I said, you know what, ma'am, I don't want to serve you anymore. You're just not talking nicely to any of us. Have a good day. You're not welcome here anymore. And she starts screaming at me. She says, I want to see the manager. Now, at 17 years old, I was the manager of the Haagen-Dazs. So I turned my back to her and I turned right back. I said, okay, I'm the manager. How can I help you? She's like, you're not the manager. I said, yes, I am. She goes, you know what? You're going to be working at this miserable Haagen-Dazs for the rest of your miserable life. And I said, ma'am, if I'm working here for the rest of my miserable life, you're still never getting any ice cream. And that woman used to get to me because she made me feel my insecurities of failure, that I was going to be trapped in some place I could never get out of. But if I could meet that woman again today, I would thank her because what she's given me is that reason to go forward and a reason to chase that absurd dream. But I promise you, even a failed dream, and I have it, my failed dream still sits on my shelf. And I have plenty of TV ideas that never got made, more than I've ever gotten made. And I'm so happy that I tried as opposed to never trying. And so I firmly believe whatever it is you're chasing, man, write it. Writing a novel is like building a sandcastle, a grain of sand at a time. You got to do it every day. And, so many people want to be writers, but they don't want to take the time to write. And that's the job. Sit in the chair, stare at the computer, and do a page a day. You do a page a day, I promise you will have a book in a year. You will. It may not be the best book, it may need editing, but you will have a book in a year. But what most people do is they go, oh, it's Monday, I'm going to write 2 pages Tuesday. You know what? I'll write 3 pages Wednesday, going to be really productive. And then it's gone. But I firmly believe, as hard as it is, there is always room for something new and beautiful. It is the one rule of art from the creation of art forward. Whether you want to mark it from the Renaissance or go even earlier, pick your time period. There is always room for something new and bold and different. In fact, there are 2 women who I don't know if I'm going to introduce you to them because you should have them on your show. But Micah, they went to North Miami Beach Senior High School. I'm trying to think what year they were. They were probably 10 years, 20 years after us. I went back to NMB and they're the Mulit sisters, but I went back to NMB and spoke to the school, and we gave out free books to everyone at North Miami Beach Senior High School. And they wrote me a year or 2 ago and said, we were in the audience that day, and because of your speech, it was the first person we knew who ever wrote a novel. And they said, and it made us think we could write a novel, and our new novel came out, and can you help us? And so, of course, I've been mentoring them since. Their new book is called One of the Good Ones, and it comes out in January. And they have become mentees of mine, but they're a breath of fresh air. 2 African-American girls who are sisters and came from NMB, and they just got a starred review in Publishers Weekly that said these are brand new voices. There's always room for a brand new voice and a brand new way of looking at things, and I love them for that.
Brad Meltzer, in the few minutes we have left with you, I have to ask you about, ring composition. What would they teach us in English class? How this circuitous route came back with your father when he witnessed your success, and the conversation with your father about the genesis of your insecurities, maybe things you didn't share over the years. That, listen, Dad, it was actually crushing and very decisive in my life to see what had happened to you, and I was running from that.
Are you asking if I did have that conversation?
Yeah.
It's funny. Now that you're saying, I'm like, I didn't, no. I mean, my dad knew my story. He saw me do interviews and he knew that was, that was the big moment of my life. But I think it's funny, when you just said it, I heard like a negative of like, oh, isn't that bad? When I tell the story, to me, it's really good because it worked out. So I think my dad always saw it. And the only way that he could see it is like, we got lucky, right? It worked. So it was, moving to Florida was the scariest thing, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. So I don't see it as like, and I don't know how he saw it, but he, you're also, and again, I'm rendering this answer in real time too. I don't think my father ever, he didn't have the self-introspection or the ability to kind of to self-assess, to be like, like my dad was a walking id. Like if my dad made $500 that week, he spent $500. If he made $10,000 that week, he spent $10,000. Like he was missing that thing in his brain that said, I might need to stop. So that self-analysis and that his favorite catchphrase was, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, I always worry about it.
No, I just wanted to kind of take you into the transition for me, which was enormously important, the son of the father becoming the father of the son, and all of the creativity that spewed forth out of that. And, now you have college-age children, and they're going through the journey of self-discovery as well.
Yeah, but my therapy sessions are all about, I was the father. Most people wait till their parents die and then you become the parent, or they get sick and then you become the parent. I was the parent at 13. I was at 13, I knew, again, I didn't know the words for it, but I was always the parent in my household because my parents were they were the best parents ever. They loved me I firmly believe no one loved their parents like they loved me. I literally wrote it on their headstone. No one loved their parents more. No one. But they didn't know what to do to be parents. And my dad was in many ways just, he didn't know he didn't know what consequences were. So I had to clean up after whatever messes he made. And so that was always a part of my life. That was our relationship. It wasn't, oh my gosh, look what this happened. And now it's happened because I wrote books. That was my life. And he knew it. He always knew that I was going to be more serious than he was. He would go in and make, dirty jokes and whatever. And I would be the one who would be like, I'm sorry he said that. Like I'd have to come in and clean it all up. And whatever financial disaster blew up, I'd be like, okay, here's what we're going to fix it and get out of it.
Well, I was just looking to shoehorn you into this killer conclusion. Look at you now in the year 2020. You are co-parenting millions of children across the planet with I am Amelia Earhart, I am Abraham Lincoln, I am Benjamin Franklin, I am Anne Frank, Xavier Riddle. Thank you, Brad Meltzer, New York Times bestselling author, for sharing your story, for sharing your vulnerability. I highly recommend everybody pick up I Am Anne Frank. It is an essential read, a difficult but necessary read in this time in our history. You are always welcome on the show.
I love this, and thanks for doing the homework, but more important, go Chargers.
Go Chargers. Full disclosure, our engineer is John Valentine. Enjoy the show on NPR One, Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts at linkfuldradio.com. Please subscribe and rate us. And hello, Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. We are now on WERA 96.7 FM, Sunday mornings at 11. Tune in. I'm Robin Farzad, back with you next week.